In the last lecture, we discussed the cultural context that influenced Marx as he moved into the circle of left Hegelian social theorists in the early 1840s. But Marxism developed as a critique and a transformation of various Hegelian philosophical ideas. So he was not simply accepting those ideas, he was beginning to develop a critique. And the revision of Hegelianism became Marx's intellectual project in the 1840s. And this is the important aspect of Marx's thought that I want to discuss in this lecture. The new social and historical theories of Marxism became exceptionally influential in European intellectual history, and also in many other parts of the world. In fact, one could argue that Marx's ideas had the widest influence of any specific intellectual in 19th century European life. But these theories always carried the traces of a mid-19th century European cultural context. And this is one of the reasons why people in the present day have found problems in Marx's theory. They say, well, it may have had good insights for the 1840s or 1850s, but we now live in a very different world. But it's very important to understand how Marx's ideas were related to that context. We've seen that Marx moved to Paris in 1843, partly because he could not find work in Germany, and partly because he saw Paris as the best place for radical German writers to publish their social critiques. And by the 1840s, Paris had become the home to thousands of political exiles. In the decade after the Revolution of 1830 in France, many thousands of exiles came there, especially to Paris, from Poland, but also from Russia, from Italy, from various parts of Germany, and many other parts of Europe. It was a kind of meeting place for exiled intellectuals and political activists. And it was in this thriving center of political and intellectual debate that Marx found the theoretical framework to develop his new conception of socialism. And soon after Marx arrived in Paris, he broke with his friend Arnold Ruge. Ruge was the left Hegelian writer who had been Marx's partner in the critical journal that folded after one issue, the French-German yearbook that never really took off as a publishing project. But Marx's break with Ruge developed because Ruge did not share Marx's new interest in socialism. He continued to be more interested in the problems of left Hegelian critiques of religion and the philosophical tradition. So Marx gradually came to believe that Ruge and all of the left Hegelians, including even Feuerbach, did not give enough attention to economics. He spent an enormous amount of time in Paris studying the history of the French Revolution and the British classical economists, in whom Marx found various theoretical flaws. He would spend hours and hours reading. Marx always had a passion for study, which had emerged even as a student when he spent days and days studying Hegel. But now he applied himself to a study of the French Revolution, to early French socialists, and to English classical economists. And he described his responses to this reading in texts that are now known as the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. And it's in these economic and philosophical manuscripts that we can begin to see the transition in Marx from Hegelianism, or left Hegelianism, into a new kind of socialism. Now, this reading was important to Marx because he always defined his own ideas by criticizing the mistakes or limits in the ideas of other writers. He would set up his opponent sort of like a thesis, and then he would develop the antithesis or the alternative and begin a debate. And this is where we can even see his Hegelian method of thought coming out in his writing, because he's always engaged in a critical dialogue with the authors that he disagrees with. And it was this process of cross-cultural critique or dialectical exchange with his opponents. It was this process that enabled Marx to develop what we now call Marxism. Now, Marx pursued a rigorous project of critical cross-cultural reading in which he used German Hegelian perspectives to criticize French and English thought. And then he launched a radical critique of German Hegelianism by using the materialists or social and economic themes of French and English thought to challenge German theories. So he uses the German tradition to attack the French and the English, and then he uses the French and the English to attack the Germans. And this is the project, the critical intellectual project, that led finally to the important book he wrote with Engels in 1845, The German Ideology, the book in which Marx first developed the full expression of his materialist conception of history. And it's this book, in 1845, that is usually seen as a transitional work from what I discussed in the last lecture as the young Marx to the mature Marx, or from the philosophical Marx to the more economic and scientific Marx. But what I want to do now in this lecture is discuss Marx's critique of the French and English theorists, as well as his critique of the Hegelians, to show the intellectual range of his multicultural, philosophical, and political project. But first we have to see how he responded to the French and the English writers that he was studying in his early reading in Paris. Marx's basic critique of both the French revolutionaries and the English classical economists stressed that they lacked an understanding of history. And for the Hegelians, historical understanding was always an essential component of social analysis. And as Marx read about the revolution in France or about the economy in England, he complained that these people did not understand enough about history. The French revolutionaries, for example, claimed to support the universal rights of man. But in fact, he said, they supported the interests of a single class. In Marx's view, the leaders of the French Revolution had been the advocates of a rising bourgeois class, a new capitalist economic class that was trying to overthrow an older feudal aristocracy. And so their ideas, in fact, served the specific class goals or economic interests of their own social group, of the bourgeoisie, the rising upper middle class, the people active in business and economic life. And so instead of supporting the true needs of people, of everyone, the people who should have the right to receive the products of their labor, the radical Jacobins in the French Revolution supported private property. And private property served the interest of only one specific class. But the Jacobins disguised this class interest because they ignored or denied their own historical specificity. They claimed they were representing a universal principle or universal political interest, the rights of man. But what they were really representing, according to Marx, was the rights of the property-owning classes. So Marx argued that the French Revolution had opened the way for the bourgeoisie, the French bourgeoisie, to take power. But these revolutionary leaders, and the theorists who supported them, lacked the historical perspective to see that their revolution also opened the way for workers. If they could have seen that the workers were also part of the revolution, that the workers also had rights, then the French Revolution would have evolved in a very different way. But Marx complained that even later, the French advocates of the workers, people like Fourier, or another socialist theorist named Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and other theorists, all lacked historical perspectives. They created utopian social schemes. They tried to describe a new social and political world, but they did not understand how this process has to evolve out of history. It simply doesn't emerge out of a revolution at one moment. It evolves out of a long historical process. And Marx said that the French socialists never linked their work to an unfolding dialectical process. This was his Hegelian perspective. The French didn't understand history, but what the French did understand was politics and the importance of revolution. This was a brilliant part of French culture, according to Marx. The French understood how to make a revolution. And by the 1840s, they had made a couple of important revolutions. But what the French needed to do was to develop a new understanding of politics that would be based on a more comprehensive understanding of history. Now, as Marx turned his attention to the British economists, he decided that the same ahistorical thinking showed up in their work as well. That the British economists, although they may be able to describe the modern capitalist economy, did not understand the historical specificity of what they were describing. And while he was in Paris, Marx spent an enormous amount of time reading the classical economists, people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, whom we've discussed earlier. And Marx came to these texts with the curiosity of a Hegelian philosopher who had never set about studying economics in any systematic way. Now, as he read Smith and Ricardo and other economists, including some important French economists, he accepted much of their economic analysis. But he argued that economists like Ricardo made the mistake of assuming that the economic conditions under capitalism were natural and universal. In fact, Marx said, these conditions, for example, the subsistence wages for workers that Ricardo had said are an inevitable part of the economic system, these conditions, Marx said, are not inevitable, they are not natural, they are not universal, they simply reflect the historical development of a particular economic system, capitalism. And so political economy, according to Marx, made a universal standard. That was the term he used. They made something universal out of what was actually what he called, quote, the worst possible state of privation which life can know. So instead of seeing this as a particular problem of a particular economic system, Ricardo had said simply, well, it's the iron law of wages, all workers must be miserable, that's the way it is. And Marx said, no, that is simply universalizing something that is particular. So the economists, according to Marx, wrongly accepted the alienating conditions, even the animal-like conditions of workers' lives, as a kind of natural law. That they looked at what was happening to workers, and instead of seeing it as an outcome of a historical process, they simply said, that's the way it is. It's a natural, universal law. So Marx interpreted the classical economists much in the way that Feuerbach had interpreted the theologians. Feuerbach had said that religion describes the human being's alienation from himself or herself as God, and then accepted this as the true nature of reality, projected from some specific situation into a universal being. For Marx, the economists made the same mistake, but the economists described the workers' economic alienation and misery as the natural condition of the species. But this description was ahistorical. Just as Feuerbach saw the theologian's description as ahistorical, Marx said this description of economics is ahistorical because the deprivation of the workers did not come from the inevitable processes of economic life, it came from the specific historical development of capitalism. This was his critique of the English economists, and in this respect it resembled his critique of the French radical political activists. But despite what Marx saw as the historical blindness of the economists, he very much admired the economic theorists for studying the material aspects of society. He said this is the right way to understand human social life. You need to look at economic relations. And so Marx drew on the English economists to develop a very strong interest in the role of economic relations in history and modern societies. But with his German Hegelian philosophical background, he condemned the economists, like the French political activists, for not recognizing the historical dimensions of economic and political life. So this is the German Hegelian critique of the French and the English. But at the same time, Marx began developing a systematic critique of the German Hegelians, and this became the other side of his critical project. And it was the critique of the Hegelians that led eventually to the German ideology, this book called The German Ideology, which he wrote with Engels in 1845, but the book was not published until the early 20th century. When Marx and Engels finished the book, they began sending it to publishers. No one would agree to publish it at the time, even though it was filled with important philosophical and economic critiques. It was dismissed as either too long or too complicated or as irrelevant, and no one would publish it. But I want to focus on this book because it is that decisive text in which Marx lays out his critique of the German tradition. He attacked the German philosophers by arguing that German philosophies of history lacked the crucial political and economic reality that the French and the English recognized in their social analysis. Hegelians understood the importance of history. This is what made them, in some sense, superior to the French and the English. But the Hegelian dialectic, as Marx explained it, was upside down. History, according to Marx, is not the story of the spirit unfolding across time. And history is not even the story that Feuerbach had told when he described human thought as a series of human projections in religion. Instead, Marx said that history consists essentially of social relations, which are ultimately shaped by economic relations. And there's no influence of a spirit here. There's no question of some transcendent being or idea or concept. It is a question of economic relations. And yet he also accepted an important component of Hegelian thought. He said that history moves through stages, as Hegel had said. Hegel had seen history as stages in the advance of freedom or of reason. Marx said history moves through stages, but these are stages of economic production, not stages of the unfolding spirit or the idea or freedom. Now, for Marx, these economic stages include the movement from feudal economies to capitalist economies to socialist modes of production. And he said that history is moving toward socialism because, in Marx's view, socialism is a more rational form of production. And here we can again see the Hegelian dimension to this thought, because Hegel had said history is moving toward higher forms of rational thought or rationalism, and Marx actually saw socialism as a more rational form of economic organization. So he was, in some sense, drawing on that Hegelian theme, but giving it an economic dimension. So from his position as an exile in France, as a German philosopher writing in Paris, Marx sought to bring a materialist emphasis to German historical analysis and thus overturn German idealism and Hegelianism. And he once said that he and Engels had found Hegel standing on his head, upside down. And what he had done was simply turn Hegel back up the right way and put him on his feet. Because we need to have our feet on the ground and realize that it's our feet and our material selves that move history forward, not our heads. We don't walk on our heads. And this became his project, how to alter all of the key Hegelian categories, how to turn German thought back on its feet. Now, you can see this attempt to transform Hegelian categories in almost everything that Marx was writing in the 1840s. And I want to give a couple of examples. Take the idea of alienation. Alienation is a concept that appears in Hegelian thought. But Marx said it takes a very different form from what Hegel and even Feuerbach had described in their philosophical works. Hegel had said that alienation occurred when the spirit or the idea became somehow separated from itself and moved into the material world. It changed somehow from a transcendent world. It became separated from itself, entered into the material world. And for Hegel, history shows the alienated spirit moving toward ultimate reconciliation with itself in the growth of reason and freedom. And Feuerbach had argued that alienation appeared above all in religion, in the alienated religious consciousness of human beings. Remember that Feuerbach had said that humans project onto God their own positive qualities and then become alienated from themselves when their essence goes to God. That's alienation for Feuerbach. The self, what is most essential about the self, the highest ideal, is placed outside the self and then worshipped as an alien being. Now, Marx said these ideas of alienation are inadequate. And he argued in his economic and philosophical manuscripts that true alienation occurs in the separation of humans from the objects they produce. Alienation is not a philosophical problem, it's an economic process. The most important human trait, according to Marx, is the ability to pursue productive activity in social relationships. This is what makes human beings different from animals. We are made human by our ability to produce different kinds of objects and to take satisfaction in the objects we produce. But in capitalism, Marx argued, the capitalist takes from workers the objects they produce. And so workers are alienated from what is theirs. They are separated from the objects that they have produced. And that is the meaning of alienation. As Marx wrote, the worker places his life in the object, but now it no longer belongs to him, but to the object. This is Marx's view of alienation. A part of the self is placed in the object, and then the object is taken away from the worker. That is, the fruit of the worker's labor, which should belong to the worker, becomes money and is actually used against the worker. And that's the meaning of alienation. So Feuerbach had said that man creates God and then worships him, worships God. Marx said that man creates capital and then worships money. But in both cases, the truly human life is being lost by, in a sense, worshiping something outside the self, which is created by people, but then taken away from them. This is what Marx called the historical process of alienation. The transformation, he said, of what should have been the Hegelian conception of alienation. But Marx also went on to say that this alienation is not natural or inevitable or permanent. And this is the way in which he transformed the Hegelianism in another way. Instead of seeing history then as moving toward a higher form of rational understanding, he said history is changing because it is moving toward a higher form of economic production. And in the end, this process will lead toward communism. Historical conditions can change, according to Marx, as in fact Hegel had also said, historical conditions change. But for Marx, this change is leading toward communism, which will overcome the alienation. And communism would be the collective ownership of the means of production, and so that everyone would benefit from the economic production of the society. This was the idea that came out in his famous line in the Communist Manifesto several years later, from each according to his abilities and to each according to his needs. Communism was the solution for the historical process. Marx said that communism is the true appropriation of human essence through and for man. It is the complete restoration of man to himself as a social being. That was the way he described communism, that through this process human beings would regain that part of the self that had been alienated under capitalism. And Marx therefore transformed this Hegelian conception of historical change into this material process leading toward communism and the transformation of the capitalist economic system. Now, like Hegel, he stressed conflict as the basic component of historical change and historical experience. But for Marx, the conflict came through the struggle between opposing classes rather than the struggle between opposing ideas. Now, this process of conflict and struggle would lead finally to the transformation that could lead to communism. And it should be seen as the logical outgrowth of an objective historical process, according to Marx. But in Marx's view, Europeans needed to change their social assumptions in order to promote this social change. As we've seen, the French political activists and English economists, in Marx's view, needed to integrate historical analysis into their political and economic work. But the Germans also needed to understand this process of social transformation would be a process of political and economic life, not simply a transformation in the realm of ideas. As he said in the German ideology, the book, The German Ideology, the Germans imagined great revolutions, but they all take place in the realm of thought. It's time to see that these changes take place in a material world, and that the dialectical process of history and of conflict is a material process built on a material base. And in this process of historical change, according to Marx again, the intellectual would have a specific role. The intellectual would contribute to history by helping to transform the social world. As Marx explained in a very famous series of theses on Feuerbach, at one point he sat down and tried to summarize how he differed from Feuerbach. And the last one of these theses made the point that, and this is a quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. And this was Marx's call to the intellectuals and the philosophers to become engaged in the social world and to see their work as part of an unfolding social process rather than as an abstract process of intellectual debate. Now, it was this conception of social action combined with the creative multicultural synthesis in Marx's theory that appeared in the Communist Manifesto, that text that had so much influence in the later 19th century. And this same kind of multicultural synthesis appeared also in Marx's later influential works, such as Capital, the work he published in London, the first volume in 1867. But more generally, it was this fusion of theory with a call to action that gave Marxism so much of its later political influence among workers and political figures as well as intellectuals. Here was a philosophical and historical theory that was urging action as well as theoretical understanding. But it was also the multicultural synthesis that made Marxism so attractive to intellectuals across the many national boundaries of Europe. Because in the following years, as people took up the writings of Marx, as intellectuals in France or England or Germany began to read Marx, they could all find in his work a theoretical perspective for challenging both the social order in their society and the intellectual traditions in their own nations. And a similar critical use of Marx would in fact spread all across Europe in the late 19th and early 20th century, including places like Italy and Russia. But I think Marx's own use of his multicultural, synthetic, critical themes appears most clearly in the German ideology. And I think that's why it remains at this, even now, the text that is most important to read to understand this transition in Marx's thought. This became the intellectual foundation for Marxism. But meanwhile, as Marx was developing his new social and historical theory that became the basis of Marxism, other intellectuals were working out the foundation for another kind of social theory that would draw more attention to the role of women. And this was the idea of feminism. And we want to turn now to the history of feminism, which was demanding new rights for women at the same time that Marxism was demanding new rights for workers. And we'll take that issue up in our next lecture.